Hi, everybody. Today is Tuesday, June 10th, 2025, and our friend Professor Marandi is back with us. Welcome back, Professor.
Thank you very much, Nima. Always an honor.
Let's get started, Professor, with the way that Donald Trump is talking about the negotiations between Iran and the United States. Here is what he said, and I want to know your take on what he said.
Iran on Thursday, so we're going to wait till Thursday.
And what's the main impediment to getting a deal?
Well, they're just asking for things that you can't do. They don't want to give up what they have to give up. You know what that is. They seek enrichment. We can't have enrichment. We want just the opposite. And so far, they're not there. I hate to say that because the alternative is a very, very dire one, but they're not there. They have given us their thoughts on the deal, and I said, it's just not acceptable.
Main topic for Prime Minister Netanyahu today when you spoke?
I would say, yeah. I don't know what else. I can talk about the weather.
Well, you can talk about Lebanon.
Yeah, your take on that and the way that the United States, what do they want from Iran, Professor Marandi?
I think it's quite clear that what the United States wants, and I think you know this and your audience knows this, what the United States wants is unacceptable. It's a demand for Iran to give up its sovereignty, to give up its sovereign right, and that's not going to happen. Iran is probably the most fiercely independent country in the world. They value their independence more than any other country that I can think of. It's unimaginable for Iran to be a part of any bloc. I mean, even now, for example, when Iran looks at Turkey being in NATO or the Saudis and others being seen as in the American camp, for them it's just ridiculous. Even Iran's very close relationship with Russia and China, within that context, Iran always remains very independent. Iran would never allow a foreign country to have bases in Iran, no matter how close the relationship is. Why? Because the Constitution doesn't even allow it, and that's the post-revolution Constitution and the identity that has been established in Iran post-revolution. That is not going to go away, and so for the Americans to demand that Iran give up enriching uranium is like giving up a piece of their territory. It's just not going to happen. So if necessary, there will be conflict. There will be military conflict. Iran is prepared for that. Iran has been preparing for over 20 years now for a military conflict. And over the past 6 months, they've been moving very rapidly to prepare themselves for a major conflict with the United States and of course the Israeli regime, but it's basically the United States. The Israelis are not a big threat, but this is what Iran is. This is where we're going if that's what the Americans want. But Trump can keep repeating himself. All he's doing is he's boxing himself in a corner, and he has failed on everything so far. He's failed on the trade war. He's failed in Ukraine. He's failed inside the United States. We see the situation right now in California. He's the bust up with the tech oligarchs and Musk in particular, and of course the continued genocide and Holocaust in Gaza, which is now being carried out basically in his name. So he has zero success across the board, both at home and abroad. And with regards to Iran, it could have been an easy solution. He could have had an easy win by being reasonable. But basically, since he is being obedient to the neocons and the Zionists, whose priorities are not the United States, American Zionists, American neocons, their priorities are not the American people. They're willing to sacrifice the American people, the interests of the United States for the Israeli regime. So basically, he's following their policies from what we can see from what he's been saying in public. From here on, we'll have to see, because Trump has a history of flip-flopping. He's constantly flip-flopping. He's on the trade war, on other issues. He's made very tough statements, and then he's had to retreat. We don't know if that's what he's going to do with regards to Iran's sovereign right, but that is not something that Iran is going to negotiate.
When it comes to the Iran's communication with IAEA, we know that recently, just 2 days ago, Iranian intelligence could obtain a lot of documents from the Israeli nuclear program. So far, what can we learn from these documents?
This was a major event, and apparently it was a very sophisticated project that took a very long period of time, and it took them quite a while to announce it. What we do know, some of it is what we guessed before, and that is that there was the strong belief that the International Atomic Energy Agency was giving Iran's confidential information to the Israelis. And now it's become clear that that's what they were doing. So the Iranians were beginning to believe that this was happening when the Israelis were assassinating Iranian scientists, because suddenly there was a spate of murders that was carried out, and the Iranians believed that the International Atomic Energy Agency was giving the information to the Israelis so that they could carry out the murders. Now it's become clear that this body is in full cooperation with the Israeli regime. So that is one key element. But also, the documents reveal a great deal about the role that European countries have played in arming the Israeli regime and helping it with its nuclear program, its military program, its weapons of mass destruction, and the links that and other links that have to do with Israeli internal workings, the intelligence agencies, the Israeli nuclear program in general. It was a major score, a major success for the Iranians, and it was carried out by the Ministry of Intelligence.
Professor Marandi, we had the head of IAEA saying that the Iranian nuclear program mostly are deep under the ground, and they cannot, any Israeli attack cannot touch it, cannot detonate what is there. How, when it comes to the Israeli attack, we know every time that Donald Trump is saying something, Iran says something, and Israel is prepared in the background to come up and say that we're going to attack Iran. Do we know what is the policy on their part? Do they really want to attack Iran? Do they really believe that they can do something with these sort of attacks?
Well, just one thing I wanted to point out, and that I was actually, when the first scientist was assassinated, when he was murdered by the Israelis and Americans, because the Israelis, all their operations are carried out with Western intelligence agencies assisting them, especially the United States. They use embassies in countries surrounding Iran and other assets that they have. I was sitting in this room in my office on campus when he was murdered. And he was a colleague of mine at the University of Tehran, Dr. Mohammed. And so it is somewhat personal. One of my students, the first person to call me was one of my students. She was an MA student of mine, but her undergraduate degree was in physics, and he was her professor. So she shifted from physics to the humanities. So she called me and told me that Professor Mohammadi was assassinated. I was literally sitting in this room when that happened. So the International Atomic Energy Agency has helped murder Iranian scientists. They have willingly assisted in the murder of Iranian scientists. That is unforgivable. And that, I think, shows that Iran in future should never trust this organization in any way or form, even though Iran didn't really trust it. But now the evidence is clear, and their complicity is completely confirmed. But so yes, that's I think that's an important point. With regard, what was your question? I got
With regard to
to
the Israeli attack, they're talking about they're prepared for any sort of
yeah.
they don't want the negotiations. They want to attack Iran, and how capable are they to do that? Any sort of
Yeah,
damage?
sorry. I was thinking. So I got too deeply into my memories and the past, and I forgot the question. It's obvious that the Israeli regime does not have the ability to destroy Iran's nuclear assets. Iran has, for well over 20 years, has been preparing itself for such circumstances. And as you recall, over the last few years, there were a series of drone attacks against Iran, targeting different places across the country, and that further intensified the process of protecting Iran's key assets and putting them underground and having defensive, creating capabilities to protect them against drones. And when the Israelis carried out the Israeli regime, when they carried out an airstrike against Iran, it was largely unsuccessful. They fired their missiles from roughly 100 kilometers away from the Iranian borders. Those missiles have small warheads because they have to be carried by F-16s and F-35s. They're not heavy missiles. So those small warheads, they have a very limited impact, and therefore they cannot create that much damage. Now, the Israelis, if you recall, later on, after people were ridiculing their failure, they started claiming, along with the Americans, that they destroyed Iran's air defenses. But of course, if they had destroyed Iran's air defenses, they would have used that opportunity to carry out wave after wave of attacks. And it's not as if the Israelis they felt sympathy for anyone. If they had the opportunity, they would have exploited to its fullest, and I would imagine that so would the Americans. So it was a failure, and the Israelis also saw that their F-35s were vulnerable, even at a distance. And that is something that the Americans also discovered in Yemen. If you recall, the New York Times was saying that U.S. F-35s that are stealth bombers, that they were almost downed by Yemen, by Ansarullah, the Yemeni armed forces. So the Israelis really can't do much, and they're much more vulnerable because a counterstrike by Iran, which Iran has been preparing itself for the last 6 months. They've been overhauling all of their missiles and drones, and they have hundreds of thousands. They're especially working on precision. The next exchange will be very different from what we saw in the past. So the Israelis really are not in a position, and if they do want to carry out an attack, they will again have to use the Americans to assist them. During the previous attack, the Americans did the heavy lifting. All of the refueling was done by Americans. They had tens of planes flying and refueling Israeli jets, and all the radar stations in Turkey and Qatar and Bahrain and the Emirates were being used to help the Israelis. Again, it shows the difference between Iran and Turkey, or Iran and these countries. All of them are, deep in inside the American camp, obedience to the empire. But in any case, those radar installations, those refueling tankers, were all necessary for that relatively unsuccessful Israeli strike to be carried out. So if in future the regime and Netanyahu want to carry out another strike, they're going to need the Americans again. They will be heavily dependent on the Americans, just like they're heavily dependent on the Americans when Iran fires missiles and drones. The radar stations again in Turkey, Bahrain, and the Emirates and Qatar are used to help defend the Israelis. The real threat would be an American attack. And an American attack is also very complicated because if they use these bases in the Persian Gulf region, those regimes, those family dictatorships will be complicit. And that will be the end of those regimes. They'll be finished very swiftly. Imagine tens of thousands of drones striking across these tiny countries and destroying their key assets. It would be over in hours, maybe a couple of days. And then all those indentured servants and semi-slaves, they would take over the land. It would be total chaos and the end of the global economy. So I don't think they'd ever dare think of, they would dare use those bases. So what they'd have to probably do is use Diego Garcia or fly from the Mediterranean, which makes it very risky. They'd have to go deep inside Iran if they want to carry out heavy bombings. And Iran's air defenses are more than formidable. And over the past few months, Iranians have been beefing up those air defenses. And again, an Iranian counterstrike would be massive. Again, the Iranians have been preparing these underground missile and drone bases for well over 2 decades. This is what Iran has prepared itself for a possible American act of aggression. And today, the United States is not the United States of 20 years ago. This is a different world. The United States is much weaker. Its rivals are on the rise. The United States is vulnerable at home and abroad. The United States is not in a position to fight with. You saw what Tucker Carlson, he did 2 tweets over the past few weeks. It's very clear he has information. He's the best connected American journalist in the country because he's close to Trump, and I'm sure he has excellent access to the military and to people in the know, and I'm sure they've told him that a war with Iran would mean a defeat for the United States with heavy casualties, and that would, I think, be the end of the U.S. empire, and probably it would bring about a much swifter end to the Israeli regime. So if Trump knows what's good for him, he definitely will not initiate in war. But he's under pressure. Well, I mean, I don't think there will be war. I should differentiate between a strike or a series of strikes and war. War is out of the question. If the Americans want to wage war against Iran, they'd have to bring 1.5 million soldiers. That's just not doable. It will never happen. They don't have the money, the support, nothing. But if they want to carry out a few airstrikes, they will be on the receiving end of severe punishment, and so will those who are complicit. So if he knows what's good for him, he won't go there. But Israeli firsters are a powerful force, and they're more than happy to sacrifice the American people.
Do you think that these people that you call them Israeli firsters, do they really believe that a war with Iran would benefit Israel? Do they really?
I have no doubt that people in the Pentagon and those who do war games and that sort of thing, they know exactly how dangerous this is for the United States, especially at a time when the United States is losing on all fronts. It's losing the trade war with China. Every day that conflict with Iran continues, the current conflict in West Asia, the genocide, the United States is being weakened, both soft power, hard power. Every day that the war in Ukraine continues, the same. The US, the West is being weakened, whereas China is doing business as usual. So the United States, I think those in the know would understand how catastrophic this would be for the United States. But there are people in the United States and among the elite, especially among the elites, who don't care for U.S. interests. They never did. All these wars that we've seen, these endless wars for the last 20 years that have destroyed the United States. 30 years ago, when the Soviet Union collapsed, it was the world's hyperpower. And for a decade and a half, they were at the top of the world. They brought it upon themselves. These people, they sacrificed the United States for their own selfish interests, for those who fund them, support them, the lobbies. And it's not just the United States. What we see right now in Ukraine, we see that the Europeans have sacrificed their own interests for the sake of the United States under Biden. Now that Trump is president, they're still sacrificing themselves for the policies of, let's call it, the deep state, or which the previous U.S. administration pursued. And both the U.S. and Europe, they're sacrificing. They've destroyed their image and their reputation and their credibility across the world for supporting this Holocaust in Gaza. So, we shouldn't expect, when we see these sort of things, we shouldn't be surprised at the irrationality and the foolishness of politicians. We assume that these people are reserves, they carry. When we look back over the events of the last couple of decades, it's clear that they are not rational actors by any means.
Looking at the United States today, they're still maybe somehow they have some sort of chance to compete with China. But if something happens between Iran and the United States in the Middle East, that would be the very end of this competition between the United States and China. That could bring a decade, I say more than a decade of war in the Middle East. They're not. We know the capability of the United States with Yemen, and they couldn't defeat Yemenis, and they want to go to war. They want to. These people who are like Mark Levin in Fox News that you mentioned, Tucker Carlson, in that tweet he mentioned the name of this guy who's preaching, who's advocating for war with Iran. And do you think, after all, the sanity, because this is not a little measure on their part, it's a great measure by the US government. Do you think, after all, the insanity goes beyond our belief that they can decide to go to war with Iran, considering the bigger picture, as you've mentioned?
I actually think that the United States has already lost against China. And I think that China is passing the US by very swiftly, and they already have in many key areas, and they will do so, and they will continue to do so in the months and years ahead. I think that the Americans are keeping their heads under the sand. They're not looking at the reality that surrounds them. They've lost, and they brought it upon themselves. And they're only making it worse through these conflicts. And I think that if there is some sort of military conflict with Iran, I don't think it's going to last for years. I think it will not last very long. The Iranians will be very decisive in their response. And Iran is a very powerful country, huge country, and it will hit the U.S. very hard. And the example you gave about Yemen is a very good one. Remember the rhetoric coming from the White House over Yemen and how they're going to crush Ansarullah, and how the U.S. Defense Secretary was dismissive of them and speaking about how he crushed them. Well, ultimately, the Americans capitulated in a month. The New York Times spoke about $7 billion wasted in ammunition, and if that doesn't include the F-18s and the drones, and it could be up to 8, 9, $10 billion wasted, and U.S. credibility again in the field was destroyed, and the United States failed to destroy Yemen's ability to strike at them. That's something that the Wall Street Journal admitted. They said that they couldn't destroy any of those underground bases. Iran's underground bases are infinitely more sophisticated and larger in number than what we have in Yemen. And Iran's drones and missiles are infinitely more advanced. And the region, the Persian Gulf region, is infinitely more sensitive than even the Red Sea. This is where much of the world's energy comes from, the gas, the oil. If there is if the price of oil goes to $300, $400, $500 a barrel, that would be the end of the global economy. People would lose their jobs across the world. It's just something that we cannot imagine. And you'd have hundreds of millions of people on the move. It would be catastrophic, far beyond the 1929 and the 1930s in the United States, the Great Depression back then. It would be far worse than that. So the Americans just simply they're in an impossible position. Their only solution, their only way out, is to have a reasonable deal with Iran, and something which is not very difficult because we've been negotiating with the Americans over the nuclear program for many years. All the bases have been covered. Everything is known. The two sides have gone over all these issues so many times before. The Iranian foreign minister right now, he's been involved in nuclear negotiations for years. He knows everything about about what sort of solutions are at hand. So it can be done. And Trump has, as I said earlier, he has zero success anywhere. People are looking right now at California. The day before, they were looking at the bust up with Musk. It's a catastrophe. But he just doesn't have the sense to recognize where that he needs a win, and instead, what he's moving is this loss.
Professor Marandi, here is what.
Am I cut off?
Yeah.
Did
yeah,
you?
we have.
Were we?
Yeah, we have some sort of issue, but you're not connected. You're not connected. Let me play a clip. Donald Trump talking about the situation in Gaza.
Attila, do you have a response at all about Israel intercepting this boat? And can you give us an update on what's happening to the entry of aid into Gaza right now? We've had people being shot by Israeli forces who are trying to get aid from the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. Yes.
Gaza right now is in the midst of a massive negotiation between us and Hamas, and Israel and Iran actually is involved. And we'll see what's going to happen with Gaza. We want to get the hostages back. That's all I can tell you. Yeah, please.
What type of negotiation he's talking about? Do they really? Who's negotiating? Is it Steve Witkoff or someone from the State Department? What do we know about that?
Well, obviously, I don't have details, but let me first remind your audience of one thing, and that is that look how. And this is just what Trump is saying is something that Western media has been saying for 20 months now, and Western elites have been saying for 20 months. The hostages are all Israeli. Palestinians, the tens of thousands of Palestinians who are in Israeli dungeons, most of them from the occupied West Bank, which even the United States, the UN, the Europeans recognize as illegally occupied. Most of them are from there. So these are hostages. Thousands of them they're in prison without being charged, and they've been there for years, many for decades. But they're not hostages. They're not even important. That was what October 7th was all about in the first place, to release the thousands upon thousands of women and children and men who were in Israeli dungeons. Many were being raped. If you recall, there was a case where a human rights organization documented how Palestinians were raped, and they immediately shut down that organization in Israel, called it a terrorist organization. So Palestinians count for nothing in the eyes of Western elites, in the eyes of Western journalists in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, liberals, conservative. Their lives have no value. The lives of Lebanese have no value. They are deeply racist, and they're obedient to their overlords who control them. So when Trump speaks about the hostages, he's not talking about the thousands upon thousands of Palestinians. With regards to the negotiations, I mean, I'm not a politician, so I can be blunt. At the end of the day, Hamas has one ally, and that's Iran. Islamic Jihad, Hamas, the resistance, they have one ally. That's Iran. Of course, the axis of resistance is a part of that alliance, but the main backer is Iran. Assad is not an ally of the Palestinians. Assad is in the American camp. Qatar is used to send weapons and support. The Americans send uh, weapons and ammunition to the Israeli regime through Qatar at times. They use the Qatari airbase to bomb Yemen, to facilitate the bombing of Yemen. The same is true with Turkey. Turkey is transporting oil to Israel. It's been doing it the whole 20 months. When the Red Sea was closed to the Israeli regime, Erdogan compensated and sent goods, extra goods, because they do trade. They have billions of dollars of trade with Israel. And they continue to have political relations. What Turkey and Qatar do is sort of like what the NGOs did in Palestine. Western NGOs went into the West Bank and they corrupted the resistance. They would, through money, they would give scholarships, they would give funding, and people became addicted to that money. What Qatar tries to do is they try to, with the immense amount of wealth that they have for such a tiny entity, is that they buy influence, and Turkey does the same. But Qatar would never provide Hamas or the resistance with a single bullet, and neither would Turkey. They would never do anything. So even when Qatar was and Egypt were negotiating, behind the scenes, the Iranians were always helping the resistance at the negotiating table. So Iran has always been assisting Hamas, in particular, with its experiences, its experience, its negotiating experiences, its legal capability. So Iran helps the resistance in all ways and forms, and it helps them at the negotiating table so that the Americans and the West are not able to cheat them. So Iran has always been Iran has always been with Hamas. So what Trump says, I don't know if there's anything new here, but in any case, it's always been Iran behind Hamas. It's not as if Turkey or Erdogan or Qatar have been doing anything in particular, or Egypt. It's always been Iran. Just like now, it's been 20 months of resistance. There's a reason why Hamas, I mean, they're courageous, they're resilient, the Palestinian people in Gaza are heroic, they're steadfast despite all the atrocities and the unbelievable injustices being carried out against them day and night, 24 hours a day. But obviously someone is helping them. Someone is assisting them with the material capability to continue resistance. So yes, Iran is definitely helping Hamas, and Iran is not shy about it. Iran is very open. Iran considers Hamas to be a legitimate resistance and a legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. And if you recall, I mean, I don't want to go over this, but when what's his name, Piers Morgan was constantly saying, "Do you condemn Hamas?" When he invited me on, I said, "No, I don't condemn Hamas. I don't condemn Hamas for October the 7th. I don't condemn Hamas for October the 8th or October the 6th or October the 5th. And nor does Iran. The victim is not the side that should be condemned. Maybe a few Hamas fighters went too far. Maybe some Palestinians committed crimes. But Hamas, the organization, they carried out an act of resistance. They wanted to take prisoners in order to have the thousands of Palestinian hostages released. So that operation was a breakout from prison, from a concentration camp. It was legitimate. The Israeli regime, their stranglehold over Gaza, which existed far before October the 7th, was illegitimate and illegal, even according to the international laws that the West pretends to abide by. So Iran supports Hamas. Iran supports it at all levels. And now, of course, we know that there were no beheadings. We know that there were no rapes. We know that the Israelis were murdering their own people with their helicopter gunships and their tanks on October the 7th. The truth came out. And the reason why the truth came out, Nima, is because of the stupidity of the regime itself. If they had discontinued the genocide after a couple of months, it would have ended and people would have believed the lies that were being repeated by Western media and by Western governments. But since it went on and people began and saw every day children being torn into pieces, mothers being slaughtered, fathers being maimed and killed, people began to ask more questions. And then there was more research being done. And since it was no longer a side issue, it hadn't become a side issue because the genocide continued to go on. It continued to be a priority for people across the world, and so they began to learn about the Nikba. They began to learn about the past injustices and the criminal behavior of the Zionist regime. They began to learn about the meaning of Zionism and what Zionism actually means. And they began to learn about October the 7th and what actually happened. So Iran is not shy about supporting Hamas, and it will continue to support Hamas in any way or form possible, as I think it was Malcolm X once said, by any means necessary.
When it comes to the role of the United Kingdom, it's not just we know that what they're doing in Ukraine and the extent of their activities in Ukraine, but when it comes to the Middle East, they're trying to somehow play both sides. We had Lamy, the foreign minister, the United Kingdom, talking about we are going to put a lot of pressure on Israel, and the day after he sent the trade guy to Israel to talk with them. And we had Lamy, the conservative leader Kemi Badenoch talking about this is a proxy war that Israel is doing on behalf of the United Kingdom. And today we've learned that they're trying to freeze the assets of Ben Gvir and Smotrich in the United Kingdom. On the other hand, today the news came out that the United Kingdom threatened to defund or withdraw from ICC over Israel arrest warrants. Who's the United Kingdom, and what can we learn from this sort of behavior that they're committing right now?
They are fully supportive of the Israeli regime. They are partners in genocide. This is their genocide. This is their Holocaust that's being carried out in front of the world. And they cannot pretend that they're not a part of this. They're an equal partner. These statements that they make after almost 20 months, now it's over 20 months, but these statements that you're referring to were made during the 19th month of the genocide. These statements were made 19 months late, but they're only made to ease pressure. And confiscating the assets, which are probably non-existent assets of these two people, what does it change? Does nothing. The regime is carrying out a Holocaust. The regime is slaughtering people day and night. As we speak, what they're doing is they're trying to buy time to ease pressure at home and to give the Israeli regime more time to finish off the Palestinian people in Gaza. We know that the British are not only supporting them in every way or form, but that the British military are helping them carry out the genocide in Gaza, that they're carrying out reconnaissance missions over Gaza in order to assist the Israeli regime. They're complete. We shouldn't be fooled by any statement made by the Canadians or the French or the British or anyone else. This is a Holocaust going on. If they want to stop it, all they have to do is sanction the Israeli regime. Block exports, block imports. But of course, when Turkey is in bed with the regime, when Egypt is in bed with the regime, when Jordan is in bed with the regime, when the United Arab Emirates is in bed with the regime, when Morocco is in bed with the regime, then it's much easier for them to continue with business as usual. The British, the French, the Europeans, and the Americans. If just one of these countries, one of these regional regimes turned against the Israelis, just one of them, the Turks, or Jordan, or Egypt, if just one of them said, we're cutting off ties, we're cutting off trade, you would see a clear shift. But the only people who've turned against the Israeli regime are in that, except for the axis of resistance, who've always been opposed to it, are in Latin America, many thousands of kilometers away. But in any case, so what Erdogan has done, and what Mohammed bin Zayed has done, and what the Qatari regime has done, is that they provided the Europeans and the Americans space in order to continue with the genocide. Because when they have continue with business as usual, then that makes it much more easier for the Europeans and the Americans to continue with business as usual, even though you've seen the polls. The world has turned against the Israeli regime. Europeans have turned against the Israeli regime. Americans have turned against the Israeli regime. But still, the neighboring countries, with both Arabic and Turkey, they're helping the Europeans get away with this.
Mahmoud Abbas sent a letter to French President Emmanuel Macron. He calls on Hamas to end rule on Gaza and to hand over weapons. When it comes to the West Bank, we know what's happening right now as we talk in the West Bank. Who's Mahmoud Abbas to the people in the West Bank and for Palestinians overall? And because when it comes to the communication between these two characters, we have to consider what's the importance of these two people, these two characters, when it comes to what's going on in Palestine.
I don't want to name names, but I know people non-Palestinians, who worked in the West Bank for many years. And they tell me the role that Western governments, NGOs have played in creating the divisions that we now see in the West Bank. And even though the polls clearly show where the hearts and minds of Palestinians in the West Bank are, but they have corrupted elements within society, especially among the elites and those who run the West Bank. They've corrupted them so much that they'll basically remain in the Western camp. And these people and those around them, they're dependent on the money, the handouts given to them by the West or those affiliated with the West. So Mahmoud Abbas, if you look at his businesses, the businesses of people around him, where their families are, where their children are, what universities they go to, where they're studying. Okay, sorry, I don't know why the connection's like this. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, right now, yeah. Go ahead. We haven't
Okay.
heard anything from your response.
Okay, you mean nothing from the very beginning?
Nothing. You just mentioned Mahmoud Abbas and yeah, the business
Okay.
they have, and
Yeah,
beyond
so the
that,
businesses that the handouts that they've been getting, these people have been getting from the West, where their children and grandchildren have studied, the scholarships that they receive to study abroad. Some of them have, passports now from different countries. The West, I mean, I'm not saying all NGOs, all international NGOs are bad, but Western NGOs are overwhelmingly bad, and we see that in Lebanon too. That's how the West uses these NGOs against the resistance. Again, I'm not saying all NGOs are bad, but the NGOs funded by Western governments or institutions close to Western governments, whether European or American, they're not good news. And they've corrupted a segment of the elites in the West Bank, and they're the jailers of Palestine. But ultimately, we're seeing the West Bank moving towards an explosion because the regime is now speeding up ethnic cleansing. They're speeding up the process very fast. They're taking new land. They're displacing people. They're destroying homes across the West Bank. This, at some stage, this is going to lead to an explosion. And the West Bank is going to be another Gaza. I don't believe that the Israelis understand how bad things are for them and how the world has turned against it. And of course, the difficulties that they have at home. But that is where it's going. Mahmoud Abbas is a jailer, nothing more. He has very little credibility. Those who support him are those who are dependent on the money that is being given to them, the handouts being given to them by the West.
We have Israelis bombing the southern part of Lebanon as well, and the Sheba farms. How we know that Emmanuel Macron somehow is connected or has some sort of communication with the Lebanese government. Is that going to help the Lebanese government? Has it helped the Lebanese government so far?
No, they're doing the exact opposite. The Europeans and the Americans, they're guarantors for the so-called ceasefire. Over the last 2 days, the Israeli regime has murdered 4 Lebanese citizens. Today, they murdered a shepherd and his son was a member of the Lebanese army. But there's no condemnation from the West. There's not even much reporting in the Western media, even though the mainstream Western media, they have journalists based in Beirut who live there. They've lived there for years, and they have drivers, they have fixers, they have producers. They know exactly what's going on in Lebanon, but they will downplay what the Israeli regime is doing. So over the last 48 hours, 4 people were murdered, 4 families with orphans. They don't care. The West doesn't care. They don't. So the West will always be Israel's lawyer, and that's why there cannot be peace with the Israeli regime. It's just not possible because this ethno-supremacist regime believes it can do what it wants. It considers other people as inferior creatures, as Amalek. It's not just the people of Gaza, it's everyone. And the West will treat it as such. Why? Because that's where the power lies. That's where the money lies. The wealthy Zionist billionaire class, the donor class, and of course the Christian Zionist cult that supports them, a cult that believes Christ supports genocide or claims that Christ supports genocide. That's how absurd and despicable these people are. But they are a very influential force. So no, the French have no interest in bringing about stability in Lebanon. They actually are, just as in Gaza, where they're facilitating and assisting the Israeli regime carry out a Holocaust. In Lebanon, they're allowing and facilitating the Israelis to bomb apartment blocks. Just a few days ago, they destroyed over 100 homes. They brought down a number of apartment blocks in Beirut. They lied about Hezbollah having factories underneath. People went and saw that there was nothing there. Is there any condemnation? No. Are there any sanctions? No. When the Israelis can carry out a Holocaust, obviously carrying out genocidal airstrikes in Lebanon or Syria or elsewhere, or the ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, that's not going to be of any concern to the West either.
Professor Marandi, when it comes to the situation in Israel, we had recently an interview with Ehud Olmert talking about the actions or the behavior, the attitude of the Israeli government. Here is what he said. I want to know your take and how do you see the Israeli society, these people who are against the genocide and what's going on in Palestine.
Is out of Gaza in order to resettle there. They don't want to see them deported because they want to prepare the ground for a Trump Tower hotel, as maybe some interpreted statements of President Trump to mean. They want it because they want to resettle there, and this is part of their grand design. They want to do the same in the West Bank. Already now they are inspiring the Hilltop youth, which I call the atrocious youth, for almost daily attacks against Palestinians in the West Bank, Palestinian Arabs in the West Bank. and they are burning their groves, olive groves. They are burning their homes. They are taking people. They are killing people. This is totally obnoxious and something that can't be tolerated. And unfortunately, it's tolerated because the fact is that it continues, and in most cases, the ones that are arrested are the victim Palestinians, it's not the Israeli attackers. And this is part of what I am campaigning against. Now, question that you have outlined is whether Bibi is captive by these guys. He is willingly captive. It's not something that he's fighting against, that he's trying to stop. He is willingly captive by these messianic, extreme fundamentalist right-wingers, supporters of Jewish terror, because it's true that this is probably the only escape he has from what awaits to him, but also because the fact is that for the last 15 years, Netanyahu was the guy that ignored the Palestinian Authority, which was a potential partner for peace negotiations, and was supporting Hamas, the financing of Hamas through Qatar, but with the agreement, support, and cooperation of the Prime Minister of Israel.
How these people that are not happy with the situation in Israel can somehow influence the public opinion in, I'm talking about the public opinion in the world, because he was the former prime minister of Israel talking this way and the way that Israel is behaving. Your take on that?
Well, first of all, I should just clarify that Qatar never provided a cent of money for the resistance. They gave them money. They wasted much more money on other useless things, but they've given money to build buildings and so on, but not the resistance itself. They have nothing to do with that, and they wouldn't dare do that. But these Israeli elites, no one should be fooled. They are not supporters of human rights, and they're not shocked by what they're seeing. It's been happening for 20 months. They've just now begun to raise their voices. And that's because I think there are a number of reasons. But most importantly, they see the world has turned against the Israeli regime. They see how despised Netanyahu is. And they see that this is going to have huge consequences for the Israeli regime and for the existence of Israel. But also, these are rivals of Netanyahu. And the West, I'm sure they would love to see Netanyahu go, have him replaced with one of these people, and they say, oh, the problem is solved. It's like, remove Hitler and Nazi Germany is fine. Remove Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and ISIS is fine, as it is now, right? Right now, you see that the head of Al-Qaeda in Syria, the former deputy head of ISIS, who used to blow up bombs in Iraq, slaughter innocent civilians, behead people, this man is going to the UN General Assembly in the United States to speak. So that's how the West works. All they think they have to do is when the day comes when Netanyahu is finally removed, and he will be removed. It's inevitable. He will fall. When that's another question. But when he falls, all of these people will be there, and they will continue to try to preserve the Zionist regime. They'll pretend that everything was Netanyahu's fault, but this is not the doing of one person. It's not the doing of two people. It's not the doing of 10 people. Overwhelmingly, Israelis support the genocide, whether it's the Ashkenazi Jews or the others. Overwhelmingly, they've supported this for 20 months. And now those who are having second thoughts, it's not because they've suddenly become decent human beings. It's because they know what's coming. They see that the regime has lost. It's never been legitimate, but it's lost its legitimacy in the eyes of the overwhelming majority of people across the world. People see the regime for what it is, and they see that, and they also want to be a part of the future when Netanyahu is gone, put in prison, perhaps some of these people sanctioned, some of these other murderers, the leaders sanctioned. These people can come to power, pretend that things are okay. The Europeans and the Americans will be satisfied, and they'll go back and they will join Jolani, giving next year's at the next year's General Assembly in the UN.
With the case of negotiation, Professor Marandi, with the United States, when you look at you mentioned the situation with the negotiation that is going on right now between the United States and Hamas, and considering bringing in and taking into account what's going on in Ukraine and the negotiations on Ukraine, what can Iran learn from the process of negotiations that are happening as we talk, and but they're not advancing?
All the Americans have done is they've reinforced the argument that the United States is not trustworthy. Trump had a chance to end the war in Ukraine, and he blew it. And now we see the United States intelligence agency and European intelligence agencies, without a doubt, involved in the undermining of the New START agreement and bombing strategic and destroying strategic bombers and threatening the world with a much more serious conflict. So this is happening under Trump. Whether Trump knew it or not is irrelevant. If he didn't know it, this has been, I'm sure, discussed before many times on your show. If he didn't know about it, that's catastrophic. If he did know about it, it's catastrophic. So the United States is simply not trustworthy. If Trump is not in charge, that's catastrophic. If he is in charge, again, that's catastrophic. So when Iran sees what's happened, how the Ukrainians carried out an operation that they claim took them 18 months to prepare themselves for, and so that without a doubt, Western regimes knew about it, then and thus undermining a very important agreement, nuclear agreement between the United States and the Russians, then how can Iran trust the United States even if we do sign a deal? Even if we do, even if Trump comes to his senses and accepts enrichment and we have a deal, who's to say that it will last more than a week? So I think Iran is going to be very careful in its dealings with the United States. And I think what it does is that it just encourages Iran to deepen its ties with the global South. You know that President Putin is planning to come to Iran, and President Pezeshkian is going to go to China shortly. These are the sort of the relationships that Iran is going to be counting on. And we see today now a sort of a strong consensus being built among the differing political groups, the reformists, the conservatives, the principalists, and others. All of them are coming to this consensus that you just simply cannot trust the United States. And the Europeans, they're irrelevant. The Europeans, they've sacrificed themselves for the Americans. And now that Trump has come, they're still sacrificing themselves for the deep state. Germany being deindustrialized. They have very little agency. And they're doing the same in Palestine. So if the Europeans are unwilling to pursue their own interests, why should Iran invest in a relationship with Europe? If the Americans are going to be untrustworthy before and after any deal, like we saw in Gaza after the ceasefire, then Trump said Palestinians must go. If they do not respect their own deals, or like in Lebanon where they're the guarantors for the ceasefire, if they're unwilling to respect their own deals, then why should Iran ever think about investing in a relationship with Europe or the United States?
Thank you so much, Professor Marandi, for being with us today. Great pleasure.
Thank you very much for having me. Always a pleasure, Nima. Thank you very much.